Montana Territory, 1878. The sun hung low over the jagged teeth of the Bitterroot Mountains, painting the western sky in vibrant hues of crimson and gold. On the rutted dirt path that passed for a road in this part of the Montana Territory, a single wagon creaked and groaned under the weight of its meager cargo. 19-year-old Josephine Ellis sat rigid on the wooden bench, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of her seat. Her golden blonde hair was swept into a practical bun at the nape of her neck, though several strands had escaped to frame a face too thin, too pale, and too frightened for one so young. She wore her best dress, a faded blue cotton garment that had once belonged to her mother. The fabric hung loose on her frame now, a testament to the hard months since Papa had taken ill. The hollow feeling in her stomach was nothing compared to the emptiness in her chest. "Not much farther now, girl," Hiram Dawson muttered beside her, his whiskey-sour breath making her shrink away. He was a man of 50 with a balding pate and yellowed teeth, but more importantly, he was now her owner. The thought made bile rise in her throat. 3 days ago, her father had traded her to Hiram for a milk cow and the promise of enough grain to last the winter. "It's for the best, Josie," Papa had wheezed through his consumption. "You'll have food and shelter. What more could a woman want in these parts?" Love, she thought bitterly, dignity, choice. But those were luxuries not afforded to the daughter of a dying homesteader with nothing but debt to his name. Josephine had always believed that the frontier demanded sacrifice. That survival meant giving up dreams of tenderness or belonging. The West was a place where people either flourished or perished, and there was no room for softness between those extremes. She had seen it in her mother's early death, in her father's slow decline, in the harshness of every season that threatened their survival. She had convinced herself that this transaction, this selling of her life and body, was just another necessary sacrifice. That this was her lot, and fighting against it would only bring more pain. Better to accept, to endure, to survive however she could. As Hiram's homestead came into view, a squat cabin with a sagging porch and untended fields beyond, Josephine fought to keep her breathing steady. This would be her prison now. "You'll keep house and warm my bed," Hiram said, his tone casual as if discussing the weather. "Do right by me and I'll do right by you. That's the way of things out here." She nodded, not trusting her voice. The false belief that had taken root in her heart since childhood grew stronger. The frontier is no place for dreams or tenderness, only for endurance. As the wagon rolled to a stop, Hiram climbed down and extended a hand. Josephine ignored it, descending on her own. Her legs trembled beneath her skirts, but she would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her weakness. "Stubborn, are you?" he chuckled, the sound like gravel. "We'll see how long that lasts." He grabbed her elbow, his fingers digging painfully as he steered her toward the cabin. The door swung open with a protesting creak, revealing a dim interior that smelled of unwashed bodies and rancid cooking fat. Josephine closed her eyes, willing herself not to retch. "Home sweet home," Hiram declared, pushing her forward. "You can start by tidying up, then we'll—" A sharp rap at the door cut him off. Hiram frowned, turning back. "Who the hell?" The door swung open before he could reach it, revealing a tall figure silhouetted against the dying sunlight. Josephine squinted, making out the shape of a man, broad-shouldered but lean, with a rifle slung casually across his back. "Evening, Dawson," the stranger said, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man of his stature. "Brought those pelts I promised." Hiram's demeanor shifted instantly, a false conviviality spreading across his features. "Riker, didn't expect you till next week. Come in, come in." The stranger stepped inside, ducking his head beneath the low doorframe. As he moved into the dim light, Josephine caught her breath. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 25, with a face bronzed by the sun and eyes the color of a summer storm. Dark hair fell in waves to his collar and a light stubble shadowed his jaw. He wore buckskins and a homespun shirt, the garments well-worn but clean. His gaze found hers, a brief assessment that felt like he was seeing straight through to her soul. Then with a small nod of acknowledgement, he turned his attention back to Hiram. "Who's this?" he asked, gesturing toward Josephine. "My new wife," Hiram announced proudly. "Just picked her up today." The stranger's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Congratulations," he said, though the word held no warmth. His eyes flicked back to Josephine, lingering on the bruises forming on her arm where Hiram had gripped her. "Name's Reed Yancey," he said directly to her. "I trap the high country." "Josephine Ellis," she replied quietly. Hiram laughed. "Josephine Dawson now, ain't it?" He slapped her back, making her stumble forward. "Now about those pelts." Reed Yancey's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, merely nodding and following Hiram outside to where his pack horse waited. Josephine stood frozen in the middle of the filthy cabin, listening to the men's voices grow fainter. Something about the mountain man's steady gaze had stirred an unfamiliar feeling in her chest, not hope, for she had abandoned that long ago, but perhaps the dangerous cousin of hope, possibility. She shook her head, forcing the foolish thought away. There was no rescue coming for a woman sold for a cow, no night on a white horse, especially not in the Montana territory. There was only survival, day by day, hour by hour. And yet, as she began the hopeless task of cleaning the squalid cabin, she found herself listening for the sound of Reed Yancey's return. Outside, Reed ran his hand along the supple beaver pelts tied to his packhorse, but his mind was elsewhere. The girl in the cabin, for she was barely more than that, had eyes that spoke volumes. Resignation, fear, and a quiet dignity that the circumstances couldn't quite extinguish. "These'll fetch a good price in town," Hiram was saying, fondling the furs with greedy hands. "You always bring quality, Yancey." Reed nodded absently, his thoughts churning. He knew Hiram Dawson by reputation, a lazy farmer who preferred whiskey to work, known to be cruel when drunk, which was often. And now he had a girl young enough to be his daughter, one who clearly hadn't come willingly. "Where'd you meet your bride?" Reed asked, keeping his tone casual. Hiram grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Old Ellis couldn't make his payments, dying of the consumption anyway. Traded me the girl for a good milk cow and some grain." He winked conspiratorially. "Got the better end of that deal, I'd say." Disgust coiled in Reed's stomach, but he kept his expression neutral. In his 7 years living in the high country, avoiding the complications of settlements and people, he developed a philosophy. Other folks' business wasn't his concern. The mountains had taught him that a man survived longest when he looked after himself and no one else. "Need anything else before I head back up?" Reed asked, eager to conclude their transaction and be gone from this place. Hiram scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Could use some more ammunition if you've got it to spare. And the wife could probably use some sugar and coffee," he chuckled, "sweeten her up a bit." The casual cruelty in the man's tone made Reed's jaw clench. Still, he nodded. "I can spare some cartridges, got coffee too, but no sugar." As they finalized their trade, Reed found himself glancing repeatedly at the cabin. Through the grimy window, he could see Josephine moving about, attacking the filth with determined swipes of a rag. Something about her quiet resolve touched a chord in him that he'd thought long dead. "It's not your concern," he reminded himself sternly. The wilderness was his home, solitude his only reliable companion. He'd learned that lesson the hard way after losing his family to a Sioux raid when he was barely 16. For 9 years he'd lived by a simple creed: attachment brings pain, better to be alone than to lose what you love. Still, as he mounted his horse to leave, Reed found himself hesitating. "I'll be back through in a month or so," he said to Hiram. "Might have some venison to trade then." Hiram nodded, already counting the coins Reed had given him for the ammunition. "We'll be here." Reed's gaze drifted to the cabin one last time. Through the window, he caught Josephine looking out at him, her blue eyes holding his for a brief, electric moment before she turned away. As he rode back toward the mountains, Reed told himself it was just his imagination that those eyes seemed to follow him, a silent plea haunting each hoofbeat as he disappeared into the gathering dusk. The weeks passed with excruciating slowness for Josephine. Each day blended into the next in a monotonous cycle of cooking, cleaning, and enduring Hiram's attentions. She learned quickly that his moods were as unpredictable as Montana weather, sunny one moment, storming the next. The bruises on her arms multiplied, joined by others on her ribs and once, after she'd overcooked his breakfast, across her cheek. She became adept at anticipating his rages, at making herself small and unnoticeable when the whiskey bottle came out. At night she would lie awake beside his snoring form and stare at the rough-hewn ceiling, searching for constellations in the knots of the wood like she once had in the night sky. Sometimes she would think of the mountain man, Reed Yancey, and wonder what freedom felt like in the high country. It was foolishness, she knew, childish fantasy. Yet the memory of his storm-gray eyes kept returning in quiet moments, a strange comfort in her bleakest hours. Autumn descended on the mountains, painting the aspens gold and crimson. Hiram spent more time at the trading post in the nearest settlement, leaving Josephine alone for blessed hours at a time. She used these respites to venture outside, walking to the edge of the property where a small creek bubbled over smooth stones. Here, she could pretend for a few precious minutes that she belonged to herself again. It was during one such moment of stolen peace, nearly a month after her arrival, that she heard the approach of hoofbeats. Tensing, she prepared to rush back to the cabin. Hiram would be furious to find her idling by the creek, but something made her hesitate. The rhythm of the horse's gait was different from Hiram's plodding mare. Shading her eyes against the afternoon sun, Josephine watched as a familiar figure emerged from the tree line. Reed Yancey sat tall in the saddle, his packhorse trailing behind him laden with what appeared to be a freshly dressed deer carcass. He spotted her immediately, raising a hand in greeting. Josephine's heart quickened inexplicably. She returned the gesture, suddenly conscious of her appearance, the faded dress now sporting a tear at the hem, her hair escaping its pins after a morning of labor. Reed guided his horse toward her, dismounting with fluid grace a respectful distance away. "Miss Ellis," he said, tipping his hat. "Mr. Yancey," she replied, appreciating that he'd used her maiden name. "Hiram is not here, he went to town." Reed nodded, his eyes taking in the bruise that was fading to yellow on her cheekbone. A muscle in his jaw twitched, but he made no comment. "I brought some venison," he said instead. "Thought you might be running low on meat with winter coming." "That's very kind," she said, genuine gratitude warming her voice. Hiram was a poor hunter and an even worse farmer. Their larder was dangerously empty. "Would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot." The invitation surprised them both. Reed hesitated, then nodded, much obliged. They walked side by side to the cabin, a careful distance between them. Josephine was acutely aware of his presence, the quiet confidence in his stride, the subtle scent of pine and wood smoke that clung to him. He moved with the easy economy of a man accustomed to wilderness, aware of his surroundings in a way that made Hiram's stumbling gait seem all the more graceless in comparison. Inside the cabin, Reed removed his hat, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. Josephine busied herself with pouring coffee into the only two intact cups, grateful that she'd managed to scrub the worst of the grime from the place. "Sugar?" she offered, holding up the small pouch Reed himself had traded to Hiram on his last visit. "No, thank you, black is fine." They sat at the rough-hewn table, an awkward silence stretching between them. Josephine wrapped her fingers around the warm cup, drawing comfort from its heat. "How are you faring?" Reed asked finally, his voice low and direct. The unexpected question caught her off guard. No one had asked about her welfare in so long that the simple inquiry brought a lump to her throat. She stared into her cup, struggling for composure. "I am surviving, Mr. Yancey," she answered honestly. "That is all one can ask for out here." Reed studied her for a long moment. "Is it?" he asked softly. "Is survival all there is to life on the frontier?" Josephine looked up, surprised by the philosophical turn. What else could there be? Purpose, perhaps connection. He seemed almost embarrassed by his own words, taking a hasty sip of coffee. "But then I've been living alone in the mountains too long, talking to myself and the wildlife." The corner of Josephine's mouth lifted in the ghost of a smile. "And what do they say in response, these conversational animals of yours?" Reed's eyes crinkled, a warmth entering them that transformed his face. "Mostly they tell me I'm a fool," he said, but with more growling and less words. A small laugh escaped her, the sound foreign to her own ears. How long had it been since she'd found anything amusing? The moment of levity faded as they heard the distant sound of Hiram's wagon. Reed rose immediately, setting down his cup. "I should see to the venison," he said. Josephine nodded, a familiar dread settling over her. She followed Reed outside, watching as he efficiently unloaded the deer carcass and began to butcher it with practiced skill. By the time Hiram's wagon rattled into the yard, Reed had nearly finished, the meat neatly separated and ready for smoking or salting. "Yancey," Hiram called, his voice too loud, his movements unsteady as he climbed down. He'd clearly been drinking at the trading post. "What brings you down from your mountain?" Reed straightened, wiping his knife on a cloth. "Brought you some venison," he said evenly. "Thought it might help see you through the early winter." Hiram's bleary gaze moved from Reed to the meat, then to Josephine. "Ain't that neighborly?" he slurred. "The wife been keeping you entertained while I was gone." The insinuation hung ugly in the air. Josephine felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. "She offered coffee," Reed said, his tone cooling. "And conversation, which is more than most would spare for a trail-worn trapper." Something in Reed's stance must have registered even through Hiram's drunken haze, for the older man backed down, forcing a laugh. "Just joshing Yancey, no offense meant." He staggered toward the meat. "This is fine work." "What do you want for it?" Reed shrugged, nothing this time, consider it a gift. Hiram's eyebrows rose in surprise, then lowered suspiciously. A gift, what for? For the coffee, Reed said simply. His eyes flicked briefly to Josephine. And the conversation. After Reed departed, Hiram's mood darkened. He paced the cabin like a caged animal, throwing suspicious glances at Josephine. What did you and the mountain man talk about for so long? He demanded. Nothing of consequence, Josephine answered, keeping her voice neutral as she prepared their evening meal. The weather, the venison. Hiram grunted, unconvinced. He had a look about him, and you. You looked different. Josephine tensed, her hand stilling on the ladle. Different how? Like you used to look before, he gestured vaguely. Alive-like. The observation was unexpectedly perceptive, especially coming from a man in his cups. Josephine resumed stirring, afraid to examine the truth in his words. Had a simple conversation really rekindled something she thought extinguished? Don't go getting ideas, Hiram continued, his voice hardening. Your mind legal and proper, your pa signed the papers himself. I know, she said quietly, serving him a portion of stew. Later that night, as Hiram snored beside her, Josephine allowed herself to remember the brief spark of connection she'd felt with Reed Yancey. It was nothing, she told herself. A moment of kindness from a passing stranger, nothing more. Yet as she drifted toward sleep, it was the mountain man's storm-gray eyes that followed her into her dreams, not the prison of her reality. High in the mountains, Reed Yancey sat before his campfire, watching the flames dance against the night. His cabin perched on a ridge overlooking a valley that stretched for miles, offering a view that never failed to settle his restless spirit. Tonight, however, peace eluded him. The image of Josephine's bruised face haunted him, her quiet dignity in the face of such circumstances both admirable and heart-wrenching. The brief smile she'd given him over coffee had transformed her, revealing a glimpse of the woman she must have been before life dealt her such a cruel hand. Not your concern, he muttered to himself, poking at the fire with a stick, not your problem to solve. Yet he knew it was already too late for such reasoning. Something about Josephine Ellis had breached the careful walls he'd built around his heart after losing everyone he'd ever loved. Perhaps it was the echo of his own sister in her situation. Sarah had been barely 17 when the raid came, her life ending before it had truly begun. Reed sighed, leaning back against his saddle. The lesson he'd learned young and reinforced through years of solitary living was simple: caring for others brought only pain. The wilderness was honest in its dangers. It was people who betrayed, abandoned, destroyed. Better to live alone, answering to no one, responsible for no one. It was a philosophy that had served him well these past 9 years, so why did it suddenly ring hollow? As autumn deepened into winter, Reed found himself making increasingly frequent trips down from his mountain sanctuary. Each visit to Hiram's homestead was ostensibly for trading, pelts for supplies, information about game movements for ammunition, but the true reason wore a faded blue dress and had eyes that haunted his solitary evenings. Hiram, surprisingly, seemed to welcome the visits. Reed suspected it had less to do with companionship and more to do with the goods and game he brought. Whatever the reason, it allowed him glimpses of Josephine's life, glimpses that increasingly troubled him. The bruises continued to appear and fade in a grim cycle. The cabin showed signs of her constant efforts to impose order on Hiram's chaos, but it remained a cheerless place. And Josephine herself grew thinner, her eyes more shadowed, though she never complained. Yet on the rare occasions when Hiram was absent during Reed's visits, she would transform. Her voice would soften, her movements become less guarded. She would ask him about the mountains, about the animals he encountered, about the stars as seen from the high country. And Reed, who had spent years in self-imposed silence, found himself talking more than he had in nearly a decade. He told her about the mother bear and cubs he'd observed all summer, about the wolf pack that occasionally shadowed him on hunts, about the majestic bull elk whose bugling echoed through the valleys. He described sunrises that painted the snow-capped peaks gold and crimson, violent summer storms that turned the sky purple with fury, and nights so clear that the stars seemed close enough to touch. In exchange, Josephine shared fragments of her own story: her childhood on a small farm near the Gallatin River, her mother's death from fever when she was 12, her father's subsequent decline into illness and debt. She spoke without self-pity, as matter-of-factly as if discussing the weather, yet Reed heard the undercurrents of loss and loneliness that mirrored his own. It was during one such conversation, in the deep of winter with snow piled against the cabin walls, that something shifted between them. Hiram had gone to the trading post despite the weather, driven by his thirst for whiskey. Reed had arrived shortly after, bearing coffee and flour that were running scarce in the settlement. Josephine had invited him in from the cold, and they sat before the fire she'd built, steam rising from their coffee cups as the wind howled outside. "What made you choose the mountains?" she asked, watching the firelight play across his features. "Most men seek gold or land or towns. You chose solitude instead." Reed stared into the flames, weighing his words. He rarely spoke of his past, yet something about her quiet presence invited confidence. "I had a family once," he said finally. "Parents, a sister. We had a small homestead in the Dakota Territory. Good land, good water." He paused, the memories both sweet and painful. "One summer morning I rode out to hunt. When I returned," he shook his head, unable to continue. Josephine's hand moved across the space between them, coming to rest lightly on his forearm. The touch was tentative, gentle. "You don't need to tell me," she said softly. Reed met her gaze, finding understanding rather than pity in her blue eyes. "It was a Sioux War party," he continued, his voice low. "Our homestead was on their traditional hunting grounds. To them, we were the invaders." He sighed. "They weren't wrong, though that didn't make the losses any easier to bear." "You were just a boy," Josephine observed. 16, he confirmed. "Old enough to bury what remained of my family. Old enough to swear I'd never put down roots again." The fire popped and hissed in the silence that followed. Reed expected Josephine to offer platitudes or expressions of sympathy. Instead, she simply sat with him in the quiet, her hand remaining on his arm, a warm anchor in the sea of painful memories. "I think I understand," she said finally, "why you choose the mountains. They ask nothing of you but respect. They don't betray or disappoint." Reed looked at her in surprise. "Yes," he said, "that's exactly it." Josephine withdrew her hand, wrapping her arms around herself as she stared into the fire. "I used to dream of mountains," she admitted. "Of high places where the air is clear and no one owns you." A sad smile touched her lips. "Childish fancies." "Not childish," Reed said, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't name. "Natural freedom calls to something in the human spirit." Their eyes met across the firelight, and for a breathless moment, Reed saw in her gaze a reflection of his own longing, not just for freedom but for connection. For someone who understood the language of loss and survival. The moment was shattered by the sound of Hiram's wagon approaching. Josephine rose quickly, moving to the stove to appear busy. Reed stood as well, adjusting his coat, trying to ignore the sudden hollow feeling in his chest. As Hiram stumbled in, bringing with him a blast of cold air and the sour smell of whiskey, Reed saw Josephine's transformation. Her shoulders stiffened, her movements became cautious and deliberate, her expression carefully blank. The woman who had sat beside him moments before, speaking of mountains and freedom, disappeared behind a mask of submission. Something broke open inside Reed's chest, a dam holding back emotions he'd thought long dead. As he made his excuses and prepared to leave, he found himself making a decision that would alter the course of both their lives. Somehow, someway, he would free Josephine Ellis from this prison. Not because he wanted her for himself, he had no right to want anything, but because no person deserved to be owned, to live in fear, to have their spirit slowly crushed beneath another's boot. Even as he rode back toward his mountain sanctuary, Reed knew he was breaking his most sacred rule: stay uninvolved, mind your own business, protect yourself from loss. But for the first time in 9 years, the thought of caring for someone else didn't fill him with dread. Instead, it felt like waking up after a very long sleep. The February blizzard came without warning, sweeping down from Canada with frigid fury. Reed had been tracking a mountain lion that had been picking off his trap line when the storm hit. By the time he made it back to his cabin, his fingers were numb with cold and his horse was laboring through drifts up to its chest. For 3 days, the storm raged, imprisoning him in his small dwelling. He passed the time maintaining his equipment, repairing snowshoes, and reading one of the few books he owned, a collection of Shakespeare's works that had somehow survived the destruction of his family home. When the sky finally cleared, the world had been transformed into a glittering white expanse. Reed knew it would be days, perhaps weeks, before the lower elevations were passable. Still, a nagging worry about Josephine tugged at him. Hiram's cabin was poorly constructed, the roof prone to leaking, the walls insufficiently chinked against the wind. "She's survived worse," he told himself as he cleared snow from around his door. "She doesn't need your concern." Yet the worry persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. By the time a week had passed since the storm, Reed found himself strapping on snowshoes and packing supplies for the journey down. He told himself it was a practical decision. He needed to check his lower trap lines anyway, and the settlement would be running low on meat after such a storm. The journey that normally took half a day stretched into two as he navigated the altered landscape. Drifts had erased familiar landmarks, and more than once Reed had to backtrack to find a passable route. By the time he sighted Hiram's homestead, the sun was setting on the second day, casting long blue shadows across the snow. The cabin looked abandoned. No smoke rose from the chimney, no light glowed from the windows. A heavy blanket of snow covered the roof, undisturbed by heat from within. Reed's concern sharpened into alarm as he approached, calling out as he neared the door. "Hiram, Josephine, anyone home?" Silence answered him. Heart-pounding, Reed pushed open the door, which swung inward with an ominous creak. The interior was dim and cold, the hearth containing nothing but gray ashes. Reed called again, moving deeper into the cabin. A soft moan from the back room sent him rushing forward. There on the crude bed lay a figure bundled in every available blanket. Reed approached cautiously, then felt his heart seize as he recognized the pale face visible among the coverings. "Josephine," he said, kneeling beside the bed. Her skin burned with fever, her cheeks flushed unnaturally against the pallor of the rest of her face. Her eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice, unfocused and bright with delirium. "Reed," she whispered, the word barely audible. "Am I dreaming again?" "No dream," he assured her, taking one of her hands between his. It was alarmingly hot, the skin dry. "Where is Hiram?" She closed her eyes, seeming to drift away before answering. "Trading post. 3 days ago, never came back." Reed felt a surge of anger so intense it momentarily stole his breath. The bastard had abandoned her in the midst of winter, leaving her to freeze or starve or succumb to whatever illness now ravaged her. "How long have you been sick?" he asked, forcing his voice to remain calm. "Since the storm," she murmured, "so cold, then so hot." Reed touched her forehead gently, confirming what he already knew. Her fever was dangerously high. She needed medicine, warmth, and proper care, none of which she would find in this desolate cabin. The decision formed instantly in his mind. He would take her to his cabin in the mountains. It was a difficult journey under the best conditions, nearly impossible with her in this state, but he saw no alternative. Here she would certainly die. "Josephine," he said firmly, making sure she was listening. "I'm going to take you somewhere safe, my cabin, but it's a hard journey, do you understand?" She nodded weakly, her eyes closing again. "Trust you," she whispered. The simple declaration pierced him like a physical blow. How long had it been since anyone had trusted him with their life? Working quickly, Reed built a fire in the hearth, then gathered what few possessions appeared to be hers: a small wooden box, a worn Bible, a hairbrush with several blonde strands still caught in the bristles. He found a tin of tea and some dried beans, adding them to his pack. While the cabin slowly warmed, he stepped outside to prepare his horse and construct a travois, a simple frame of branches covered with blankets that could be dragged behind his mount. It was a native method for transporting the sick or wounded, one Reed had learned during his years of wandering after his family's death. By the time he re-entered the cabin, Josephine was sitting up, though she swayed alarmingly. The brief rest and warmth of the fire seemed to have granted her a moment of lucidity. "You came," she said, her voice stronger but still rough with illness. "How did you know?" Reed shrugged, uncomfortable with the gratitude in her gaze. "Just a feeling," he said. "We need to leave soon before nightfall." Josephine nodded, then looked down at her sweat-soaked dress with dismay. "I should change." Reed found her a relatively clean dress hanging from a peg, then stepped outside to give her privacy. When he returned, she was dressed but trembling with the effort, her face white with exhaustion. Without a word, Reed gathered her into his arms, surprised at how light she was. Josephine's head rested against his shoulder, her breathing quick and shallow. He carried her to the waiting travois, settling her as comfortably as possible among the blankets. "It won't be easy," he warned, tucking the blankets around her. "But my cabin is warm and dry, and I have medicines for the fever." "What about Hiram?" she asked, her voice small. Reed's expression hardened. "If he returns, he'll find an empty cabin." "He'll come after me," she whispered. "He paid for me." "Let him try," Reed said simply, the quiet certainty in his voice more threatening than any shouted challenge could have been. As they set off through the deepening twilight, Reed Yancey found himself making promises in his heart that contradicted everything he'd believed about survival on the frontier. He had spent 9 years convincing himself that isolation was safety, that attachment was weakness, that the only true security lay in answering to no one and caring for no one. Yet here he was, risking everything to save a woman he barely knew, making himself responsible for a life beyond his own. The old Reed would have called it foolishness of the highest order. But as he glanced back at Josephine's sleeping form on the travois, her golden hair spilling across the blankets like sunlight, he couldn't bring himself to regret his decision. For the first time since watching smoke rise from his family's burning homestead, Reed felt something dangerously close to hope stirring in his chest. The journey to Reed's cabin was a nightmare of cold, exhaustion, and fear. Josephine drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes murmuring deliriously, other times frighteningly still. Reed stopped hourly to check on her, forcing sips of water between her cracked lips, adjusting the blankets against the biting wind. Progress was agonizingly slow. The horse labored through the deep snow, and Reed often had to break trail on foot, leading the animal by the reins. What should have been a day's travel stretched into two as they climbed steadily higher into the mountains. By the time his cabin came into view, nestled against a sheltering cliff face with the valley spread out below, Reed was nearly as exhausted as his horse. But the sight of home sent a fresh surge of energy through his weary limbs. He urged the horse forward, speaking encouragingly to Josephine, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. The cabin was cold and dark after his absence, but Reed worked with efficient speed to bring it to life. He built a fire in the stone hearth, its warmth quickly filling the single room. He carried Josephine inside, laying her gently on his bed, a sturdy frame covered with a straw-filled mattress and furs. She stirred as he tucked the blankets around her, her eyes opening to take in the unfamiliar surroundings. "Where?" she began. "My cabin," Reed said, his voice rough with fatigue. "You're safe now." Josephine's gaze wandered over the simple interior. The stone hearth dominating one wall, shelves lined with books and jars of dried herbs, a table and chair near the single window, everything neat and orderly. "It's lovely," she whispered before her eyes fluttered closed again. Reed allowed himself a moment of pride. The cabin had been his project for years, each improvement made with his own hands, the stone hearth that never smoked, the tight-fitting logs that kept out the worst of the mountain winds, the window glass he'd hauled up from the settlement at great expense. He turned his attention to Josephine's fever, brewing a tea of willow bark and other herbs he'd learned about from a Flathead medicine woman years ago. When the concoction was ready, he gently lifted Josephine's head, helping her drink the bitter liquid. "Tastes awful," she murmured, wrinkling her nose. "The worse the taste, the better the medicine," Reed replied with a small smile. "My mother always said that." Josephine managed a weak smile in return before drifting back to sleep. Reed settled into the chair beside the bed, prepared for a long night of vigilance. The fever broke shortly before dawn. Reed, who had dozed fitfully in the chair, woke to find Josephine watching him, her eyes clear for the first time since he'd found her. "You stayed," she said softly. Reed straightened, wincing at the stiffness in his neck. "Of course." "No of course about it," Josephine contradicted gently. "You could have left me at Hiram's or with neighbors, or at the settlement. Instead, you brought me to your sanctuary." Her perception made Reed uncomfortable. He stood, moving to check the fire. "You needed care, this was the closest safe place." 3 days' journey in winter is hardly closest, she observed, pushing herself up to a sitting position. Though still pale, her face had lost the alarming flush of fever. "But thank you for saving my life." Reed nodded awkwardly, unused to gratitude. "How do you feel?" "Weak," Josephine admitted, "but better, much better." "Good. You should rest more, I'll make some broth." As he busied himself at the small stove, Reed felt Josephine's eyes following him. The awareness of her presence in his space, this private sanctuary he'd shared with no one for years, was both unsettling and oddly pleasant. "This is a beautiful place," she said, looking around with more attention now that she was fully conscious. "Did you build it yourself?" Reed nodded. "Took 3 summers. I lived in a linta while I worked on it." He gestured toward the stone hearth. "The chimney was the hardest part, had to haul each stone up from the creek bed." "It was worth the effort," Josephine said. "It doesn't smoke at all." The simple observation pleased him more than it should have. How long had it been since anyone had noticed or appreciated his craftsmanship? Over the next few days, as Josephine regained her strength, Reed discovered what it meant to share his solitary existence. He found himself explaining the rhythms of his days, when he checked trap lines, where the best hunting was found, how he preserved meat and gathered herbs. Josephine listened with genuine interest, asking questions that showed she understood the practicalities of frontier life. In turn, she began to help with small tasks as her strength returned, sorting herbs, mending clothes that Reed had neglected, reading aloud from his small collection of books in the evenings. Her voice, sweet and expressive, brought Shakespeare's words to life in a way Reed's solitary readings never had. They developed an easy routine, moving around each other in the small cabin with a growing familiarity. Reed found himself noticing things he'd never paid attention to before: the way sunlight caught in Josephine's hair when she sat by the window, the small hum she made when concentrating on a task, the curve of her smile when something amused her. It was dangerous territory, these noticings. Reed reminded himself sternly that this arrangement was temporary. Once she was fully recovered and the trails cleared, he would take her to the settlement. She could make a new life there, perhaps working at the hotel or finding a position with one of the respectable families. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, it left a hollow feeling in his chest. One evening, as they sat before the fire after supper, Josephine brought up the future that Reed had been avoiding thinking about. "What will happen when the snow melts?" she asked, her fingers busy with a piece of mending. Reed stared into the flames, considering his words carefully. "That depends on what you want," he said finally. "What I want," Josephine repeated softly, as if the concept was foreign. "I'm not sure anyone has asked me that in years." Reed looked at her then, really looked at her. In the firelight, with her golden hair loose around her shoulders and color returned to her cheeks, she was breathtakingly beautiful. But it was more than that. There was a quiet strength in her that had survived Hiram's cruelty, a dignity that hardship couldn't diminish. "I'm asking now," he said. Josephine set aside her mending, her blue eyes meeting his with unexpected directness. "I want freedom," she said. "I want to never be owned again. Beyond that," she smiled sadly, "I haven't allowed myself to want anything for so long." Reed nodded, understanding completely. "When the trail's clear, I'll take you to the settlement," he promised. "The hotel owner's wife is a good woman. She might have work for you. Or there's the new school teacher. She's been looking for help with the younger children." "And Hiram?" Josephine asked, her voice smaller now. Reed's expression hardened. "Hiram abandoned you in winter, left you to die of fever. Any claim he thinks he has on you died with that decision." "The law might not see it that way," Josephine pointed out. "He has papers. My father's signature." "Then we'll go further," Reed said, surprising himself with the determination in his voice. "Helena maybe, or all the way to Oregon, somewhere he can't follow." Josephine looked at him curiously. "Wait." Reed faltered, suddenly aware of what he'd implied. "I just meant I would help you get there, see you settled safely." Something like disappointment flickered across her face, quickly masked. "That's very generous," she said politely, picking up her mending again. "But I wouldn't want to impose on your solitude any more than I already have." The conversation lapsed into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Reed wanted to explain himself better, to tell her that her presence hadn't been an imposition at all. That, in fact, the cabin already felt emptier at the thought of her leaving. But the words stuck in his throat, imprisoned by years of believing that such admissions only led to pain. That night, as Reed lay on his makeshift pallet near the fire, listening to Josephine's soft breathing from his bed across the room, he confronted the truth he'd been avoiding since finding her in Hiram's cold cabin. He was falling in love with Josephine Ellis. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it settled over him with the strange comfort of finally acknowledging what he'd known in his heart for weeks. The woman sleeping across the room had somehow breached all his defenses, awakening feelings he'd thought long dead. Reed stared up at the darkened ceiling, remembering his sister Sarah's favorite passage from the Shakespeare volume he'd saved. "Love looks not with the eyes but with the mind, and therefore is winged Cupid painted blind." Perhaps love was blind. Blind enough to overcome 9 years of deliberate isolation, blind enough to risk heartbreak again, blind enough to imagine a future that included another person when he'd sworn never to do so. But as Reed finally drifted toward sleep, one clear thought remained: whatever came next, he would ensure Josephine's freedom, even if it meant letting her go. Spring came to the mountains in fits and starts, warm days that melted the snowpack, followed by fierce storms that added fresh layers of white. Through March and into April, Reed and Josephine remained in their peaceful isolation, their rhythm of shared days growing ever more natural. As Josephine's strength fully returned, she insisted on taking on more responsibilities. She learned to set snares under Reed's patient instruction, became adept at identifying edible spring plants, and proved to be a better shot with his old revolver than Reed himself. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" he asked in amazement after she hit 5 targets in succession. Josephine smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "My mother believed girls should know how to protect themselves. Papa never approved, but she taught me anyway when he was in the fields." Reed found himself constantly surprised by the depths of her. The quiet, resigned woman he'd first met at Hiram's cabin had been a pale shadow of the real Josephine Ellis, a woman of intelligence, humor, and remarkable resilience. They spoke of many things during those lengthening spring days, but neither mentioned the future again. It hung between them, unacknowledged yet ever present, the knowledge that when the mountain passes cleared completely, decisions would have to be made. Reed found himself inventing reasons to delay their departure. The horses needed more time to recover from winter. The lower trails were still too muddy. There were rumors of outlaws on the road to the settlement. Each excuse was plausible enough, but the truth was simpler. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her. Josephine never pressed him, though sometimes he caught her looking at him with a question in her eyes that made his heart race. Was it possible she felt the same reluctance to end their shared solitude? The question remained unasked, the delicate balance of their relationship maintained by mutual silence about what might come next. Then, on a bright May morning with wildflowers carpeting the meadow below the cabin, everything changed. Reed had gone to check his most distant trap line, leaving Josephine to tend the small garden they'd started near the cabin. He returned earlier than expected, a brace of rabbits slung over his shoulder to find the cabin door ajar. Immediately his senses heightened. Josephine never left the door open, the mountain air was still too cool, and she was careful with the fire's heat. "Josephine," he called, reaching instinctively for the rifle slung across his back. No answer came. Reed approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the clearing around the cabin for any sign of disturbance. Nothing seemed amiss, yet his years in the wilderness had taught him to trust the prickling sense of wrongness that now raised the hair on the back of his neck. He pushed the door open wider, rifle ready. The cabin's interior was neat as always, the fire burning low in the hearth. Nothing appeared disturbed or missing, but Josephine was nowhere to be seen. "Josie." He called again, using the nickname that had slipped naturally into his speech in recent weeks. A sound outside drew his attention, the soft nicker of a horse that wasn't his own. Reed spun, moving back to the doorway in 2 long strides. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood Hiram Dawson, one meaty hand gripping Josephine's arm. His other hand held a pistol pointed squarely at her head. "Well, well," Hiram called, his voice carrying clearly across the open space. "Look what the mountain man's been hiding all this time." Reed's blood turned to ice. He stepped fully onto the porch, keeping his rifle low but ready. "Let her go, Dawson," he said, his voice deadly calm. "Now why would I do that?" Hiram sneered. "She's mine, legal and proper, got the papers to prove it." Josephine stood rigidly in Hiram's grasp, her face pale but composed. She met Reed's gaze across the clearing, and he read both fear and determination in her blue eyes. "The law doesn't recognize ownership of people," Reed said, taking a careful step forward. "Not even out here." Hiram laughed, an ugly sound. "Call it what you want, marriage, ownership, don't make no difference, she belongs with me." His fingers dug cruelly into Josephine's arm. "Ain't that right, wife?" Josephine said nothing, her eyes never leaving Reed's face. "How did you find us?" Reed asked, stalling as he assessed the situation. Hiram was drunk, he could smell the whiskey from 20 paces, but the hand holding the gun was steady enough. "Weren't hard," Hiram said proudly. "Everyone knows Reed Yancey's got a cabin up near Eagle Ridge, just had to wait for the snow to melt enough to make the climb." His eyes narrowed. "Didn't expect to find my property playing house with you, though." Reed took another careful step forward. "She was dying when I found her," he said evenly. "You left her alone in that sorry excuse for a cabin with a raging fever. She would have been dead in another day." Something flickered in Hiram's bloodshot eyes, perhaps a moment of shame quickly banished. "Had business in town," he muttered, "wasn't gone that long." 3 days, Josephine spoke for the first time, her voice steady despite the gun at her temple. "You were gone 3 days, and you knew I was ill when you left." Hiram's face darkened. "Shut your mouth, woman." Reed used the momentary distraction to take another step closer. He was still too far for accuracy with his rifle against a moving target, especially with Josephine so close to Hiram. He needed to get nearer or to separate them somehow. "Let's discuss this reasonably," he suggested, his tone deliberately calm. "Why don't you lower that gun and we can talk about compensation?" Hiram's eyes lit with greed. "Compensation?" Reed nodded. "For your trouble. I've got pelts worth a good sum. Gold too, a little. Enough to buy a proper wife from the marriage broker in Helena if that's what you're after." The suggestion was calculated to appeal to Hiram's baser nature, while implying that Josephine was somehow defective merchandise. Reed saw her slight flinch at his words and silently apologized, hoping she understood his strategy. Hiram appeared to consider the offer, his grip on Josephine loosening slightly. "How much gold?" he asked suspiciously. "Come inside, I'll show you," Reed offered, gesturing toward the cabin. "No sense discussing business out in the open." For a moment, Reed thought Hiram would agree. The man took a half-step forward, his greed visibly warring with his suspicion. Then Josephine moved. It happened so quickly that Reed almost missed it. One moment she was standing rigidly in Hiram's grasp, the next she had dropped to her knees, twisting away from the gun. The sudden movement threw Hiram off balance. He staggered, the pistol discharging harmlessly into the air. Reed didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired, the shot catching Hiram in the shoulder. The older man howled in pain, dropping his pistol as he clutched at the wound. Josephine scrambled away, running toward Reed as Hiram bellowed curses behind her. Reed met her halfway across the clearing, pushing her behind him as he kept his rifle trained on the wounded man. "You shot me," Hiram screamed, blood seeping between his fingers. "You actually shot me." "Be grateful it was your shoulder," Reed replied coldly. "Next one goes through your heart if you take another step toward her." Hiram's face contorted with rage and pain. "She's mine, the law says." "The law also says abandonment voids a marriage contract," Josephine interrupted, her voice remarkably steady. She stepped up beside Reed, no longer hiding behind him. "You left me to die, Hiram. Any claim you had died with that decision." Hiram stared at her, momentarily speechless. This wasn't the cowed, submissive woman he'd purchased. This Josephine stood tall, her chin raised, her eyes clear and unafraid. "Who do you think you are?" he sputtered finally. "Some fine lady, you're nothing, nobody, your own pa sold you for a cow." The words were meant to wound, to remind Josephine of her worthlessness. Reed tensed, ready to intervene, but Josephine merely smiled, a small, sad smile that somehow held more dignity than any angry retort. "Yes," she said simply, "he did. But that doesn't mean I have to remain sold." The quiet certainty in her voice seemed to deflate Hiram more than the bullet in his shoulder. He slumped, suddenly looking older and smaller. "You ain't worth the trouble anyway," he muttered, backing toward his horse. "Scrawny thing, never could cook worth a damn." Reed kept his rifle trained on Hiram as the man awkwardly mounted his horse one-handed, still cursing under his breath. Only when Hiram had ridden well out of sight down the mountain trail did Reed finally lower his weapon. The moment he did, his knees nearly buckled with delayed reaction. He turned to Josephine, needing to see for himself that she was unharmed. She stood exactly where he'd left her, her face pale but composed. As their eyes met, a tremor passed through her, and suddenly she was in his arms, her body shaking with silent sobs. "It's over," Reed murmured, holding her close, breathing in the scent of her hair. "He's gone, you're safe now." Josephine clung to him, her tears soaking into his shirt. Reed stroked her back gently, murmuring reassurances, marveling at her courage. She had faced down the man who had terrorized her for months, had seized her own moment to act when Reed's plan was still unfolding. The woman in his arms was no victim, she was a survivor, as tough and resilient as the mountains themselves. When her tears finally subsided, Josephine pulled back slightly, wiping at her cheeks with embarrassment. "I'm sorry," she began. Reed shook his head. "Don't apologize, not ever." "Not to me," he brushed a strand of hair from her damp cheek. "You were magnificent." A small smile touched her lips. "I was terrified," she admitted. "Being brave isn't about not feeling fear," Reed said. "It's about acting despite it." Josephine looked up at him, really looked at him, her blue eyes searching his face as if seeing him for the first time. Whatever she found there seemed to answer some question in her mind, for her expression softened. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Reed took a deep breath, knowing they had reached the moment he'd been avoiding for weeks. The safe answer would be to suggest taking her to the settlement to help her start a new life away from both Hiram's cruelty and Reed's own complicated feelings. Instead, he found himself asking, "What do you want to happen?" Josephine's gaze never wavered. "I want to stay," she said simply, 3 words, so simple yet they shifted the entire world on its axis. Reed stared at her, afraid to believe what he was hearing. "Here," he clarified, "in the mountains." "Here," Josephine confirmed. Her cheeks flushed slightly, but she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "With you if that's what you want too." Reed's heart hammered against his ribs. 9 years of solitude, of believing that isolation was the only path to safety, seemed to fall away in an instant. All his carefully constructed arguments about why caring for others was dangerous now seemed hollow in the face of this simple truth. He loved Josephine Ellis, and a life without her, even his peaceful mountain solitude, would be empty. "It is," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's what I want more than anything, but Josie, you should know, I'm not an easy man. I've been alone a long time. I might not be good at sharing a life." Josephine's smile widened, a brightness entering her eyes that took his breath away. "Then we'll learn together," she said. "I haven't exactly had practice at a happy partnership either." Reed laughed, the sound surprising both of them. Then more seriously he added, "Hiram might come back, or others like him. The mountains aren't always kind and winters are hard. It won't be an easy life." "No life worth living is easy," Josephine replied. "But facing hardships with someone she hesitated, then continued more softly, with someone you care for makes them bearable." Reed reached out, cupping her face gently in his calloused hands. "Someone you love," he corrected, the word no longer frightening now that it was finally spoken aloud. "Because I do love you, Josephine Ellis, more than I thought possible." Tears welled in her eyes again, but this time they were accompanied by a smile of such radiance that it rivaled the spring sunshine. "And I love you, Reed Yancey, my mountain man who treats me not like property to be owned, but like a queen of these wild places." Reed kissed her then, beneath the vast Montana sky, with wildflowers nodding around their feet and the mountains standing sentinel in the distance. It was a kiss 9 years in the making, tender yet urgent, a promise and a homecoming all at once. When they finally broke apart, Reed rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed, savoring the moment. "We should make it official," he said, "a proper marriage in the settlement. So no one can ever question your freedom or my claim." Josephine laughed softly. "Are you proposing, Mr. Yancey?" Reed pulled back slightly, suddenly realizing he'd done this all wrong. "I am," he said seriously. Though not very well, he took her hands in his, meeting her gaze directly. "Josephine Ellis, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife, not because any man sold you or claimed you, but because you choose it freely as I choose you?" Josephine's smile could have lit the darkest night. "Yes," she said simply, "with all my heart, yes." Later that evening, as they sat together before the fire in the cabin that would now be truly home to both of them, Josephine rested her head against Reed's shoulder, her voice thoughtful. "Do you ever think about it," she asked, "how strange life's paths can be?" Reed's arm tightened around her shoulders. "How do you mean?" "If my father hadn't been desperate enough to sell me for a cow. If Hiram hadn't abandoned me during the blizzard, if you hadn't followed your instinct to check on me, we might never have found each other." Reed considered this, watching the firelight play across her beautiful face. "Perhaps," he acknowledged, "or perhaps we would have met some other way. I like to think some things are meant to be despite all odds." Josephine smiled, nestling closer. "The romantic mountain man," she teased gently. "Who would have guessed?" Reed chuckled, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Only you," he said. "And only because you showed me that the heart, like these mountains, can weather any storm if it's strong enough." Outside, twilight deepened into true night, stars appearing one by one in the vast Montana sky. Inside the cabin, the fire burned warm and bright, illuminating the beginning of a story neither Reed nor Josephine could have imagined just months before. A story of 2 souls who had found in each other not just love, but home. 3 months later, on a perfect August day, Josephine Ellis became Josephine Yancey in a simple ceremony at the settlement's small church. She wore a new dress of pale blue calico, with wildflowers in her golden hair. Reed, almost unrecognizable in his store-bought suit, couldn't take his eyes off her as they spoke their vows before the circuit-riding preacher. The few guests, mostly curious townspeople who'd heard rumors of the mountain man's romance, whispered among themselves about the unlikely couple. Some recalled the silent, bruised young woman they'd glimpsed during Hiram Dawson's infrequent visits to town. Others knew Reed Yancey only by reputation, the solitary trapper who came down from the mountains twice a year to trade furs and vanished again like a ghost. No one quite understood how these two had found each other, but even the most cynical observer couldn't deny the obvious love between them as they exchanged rings. His a simple band of silver, hers crafted by Reed's own hands from a small gold nugget he'd panned years ago and saved without knowing why. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher declared. "You may kiss your bride." Reed hesitated, unaccustomed to such public displays. But Josephine rose on tiptoes, her blue eyes dancing with happiness, and he found he didn't care who was watching. He kissed her gently, sealing their vows with a tenderness that belied his rugged exterior. The small congregation applauded politely, though many still looked bewildered by the match. Only Mrs. Thompson, the hotel owner's wife who had helped Josephine prepare for the wedding, seemed to truly understand. As she hugged the bride afterward, she whispered, "You found a good man, my dear." "A quiet one but true." Josephine squeezed the older woman's hands. "The best man," she agreed, "one who sees me as I truly am." The celebration that followed was modest, cake and coffee at the hotel, a few gifts from townspeople who'd never even spoken to the couple before. Reed endured the socializing with stoic patience, clearly counting the minutes until they could escape back to the mountains. Josephine, watching him try to make conversation with the blacksmith, felt a rush of tenderness. He was doing this for her, enduring the crowd, the attention, the well-meaning but intrusive questions. For her sake, he had emerged from his sanctuary, allowing others into his carefully guarded world. It was a gift greater than any ring or vow. When they finally departed, riding away from the settlement with provisions for the coming fall packed on their packhorse, Josephine felt a lightness she hadn't known since childhood. Ahead lay the mountains, their peaks catching the late afternoon sun. Beside her rode the man she loved, whose quiet strength had shown her that tenderness could exist even in the harshest places. And within her heart bloomed the certainty that whatever challenges the frontier might bring, they would face them together. Halfway up the mountain trail, Reed suddenly reined in his horse. "Wait," he said, dismounting and helping Josephine down as well. "What is it?" she asked, puzzled by the halt. Reed smiled, taking both her hands in his. "I just realized something," he said. "All these years I've crossed this spot and thought of it as the boundary between the settlement and my solitude, the place where I left civilization behind." He glanced up at the mountains rising before them, then back at her face. "But now it's the place where I begin journeying home, with you." Josephine felt tears prick her eyes at the simple poetry of his words. "Home," she repeated softly. "Yes, that's what we found, isn't it? Not just a place, but each other." Reed nodded, drawing her into his arms. "Who would have thought," he murmured against her hair, "that a lone mountain man could find his heart's true home in a woman once sold for a cow?" Josephine laughed, the sound echoing joyfully off the mountainsides. "And who would have believed," she countered, "that a girl who thought herself worthless could become a queen in the eyes of the man she loves?" Reed kissed her then, beneath the vast Montana sky, surrounded by the wilderness that had once been his only companion. In that kiss was a promise of days and nights shared, of challenges faced together, of a love as enduring as the mountains themselves. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they remounted and continued their journey, riding side by side toward the cabin that awaited them. It was no longer just Reed's sanctuary, nor merely a shelter for Josephine's recovery. It had become something more profound, a home built not just of logs and stone, but of trust and hope and love. And in the years that followed, through harsh winters and glorious summers, through the birth of their children and the gradual building of a true homestead, through all the joys and sorrows that frontier life brought, Reed and Josephine Yancey never forgot the unlikely path that had brought them together, or the truth they had discovered in each other's arms. That even in the wildest places, the human heart can find its way home.